The moon hung like a broken promise over the Blackthorn Mountains, casting its pallid light across the jagged peaks that had once been the crown jewels of the vampire dominion. Centuries ago, these mountains were feared and revered, their shadows stretching across kingdoms like the fingers of death itself. But now, in the year of waning magic and forgotten oaths, they stood as silent monuments to a fallen empire. The wind that swept through the crags carried no warmth, only the whispers of old battles and older betrayals. And deep within the heart of these forsaken peaks, buried beneath layers of stone and sorrow, lay the Crimson Keep, a palace that had once been the jewel of vampire aristocracy, now reduced to little more than a tomb of memories and shattered pride. Cale Dravener had not come here seeking glory. Glory was a luxury for those who had homes to return to, families who waited with lanterns in windows, lovers who kept beds warm against the night. Cale had none of these things. What he had was a contract, parchment yellowed with age, bearing a seal he didn't recognize and terms he barely understood, and a debt that gnawed at his conscience like a wolf at carrion. The contract spoke of a prisoner, a being of immense power held in magical chains for crimes unspoken, and a reward substantial enough to rebuild his ruined village 3 times over. The guild master who'd handed him this assignment had looked at him with eyes full of pity, the kind reserved for men already dead. "This one's different, Dravener," the old man had said, smoke curling from his pipe like lost souls seeking heaven. "The chains aren't to keep her from escaping. They're to keep her from remembering." Now, as Cale descended the spiraling stone stairs that led deep into the palace's heart, those words echoed in his mind with each footfall. The air grew colder with every step, and the torches that had once lit these passages were long extinguished, leaving only the faint bioluminescence of ancient fungi clinging to the walls like desperate prayers. His armor, dark iron forged in the northern smithies and inscribed with protective wards, felt heavier here as though the very atmosphere pressed against him with malevolent intent. His breath misted before his face, and he could feel the weight of centuries bearing down upon his shoulders. This place was not meant for the living. Every instinct he'd honed over 12 years of monster hunting screamed at him to turn back, to climb those stairs and never look upon this cursed place again. But Cale had never been good at listening to sense. The chamber he finally entered was a cathedral of ruin. Once it must have been breathtaking, a throne room or perhaps a hall of judgment, with vaulted ceilings that soared into darkness and columns carved from obsidian that reflected no light. Moonlight poured through a massive rent in the ceiling, a wound in the palace's flesh that looked as though some god had reached down and torn the stone apart with bare hands. The light fell in silver sheets, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits too weak to fully manifest. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, throne fragments, shattered tables, the remains of what might have been a grand chandelier now reduced to twisted metal and scattered crystal. And everywhere, carved into the walls and floor, were runes that pulsed with a dim crimson light, like dying embers refusing to surrender to the ash. In the center of this devastation, bound to a pillar of black stone that rose from floor to darkness, was the vampire princess. Cale's breath caught in his throat and for a moment he forgot why he'd come. She was impossible. That was the only word his mind could conjure. Legend spoke of vampire nobility as creatures of terrible beauty, beings who could steal sanity with a glance and reduce the strongest warriors to weeping children with a smile. He dismissed such tales as exaggeration, the fearful fantasies of peasants who'd never seen a real vampire and wouldn't recognize one if it drained them dry. But standing here looking at her, Cale understood that legends were sometimes pale shadows of a truth too bright to fully capture. Her skin was the color of moonlight on fresh snow, so pale it seemed to glow from within, veins of silver visible just beneath the surface like rivers of starlight flowing through flesh. Long hair cascaded over her shoulders and down her back, a river of midnight black shot through with streaks of crimson that seemed to move independent of any breeze, each strand alive with its own dark vitality. Her features were aristocratic, high cheekbones, a straight nose, lips full and colored like old blood, all arranged in a face that seemed carved by an artist who understood both beauty and cruelty in equal measure. But it was her eyes that held him. They glowed with an inner fire, crimson as fresh spilled blood yet somehow sad, ancient and weary in a way that spoke of centuries witnessed and endured. And her wings. God and all the saints, her wings. They spread from her back, vast membranes of darkness that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. The bone structure was elegant, each joint articulated with terrible grace, and the membrane itself was like black silk stretched across a frame of ivory. They were folded partially against her body now, constrained by the chains, but even diminished they dominated the space, suggesting a span that would eclipse the moon if fully extended. The chains themselves were works of art and horror intertwined. Not iron or steel but something else, crystallized magic perhaps, or prayers given physical form. They glowed with soft golden light, inscribed with runes and languages Cale didn't recognize, and they wound around her wrists, her throat, her waist, binding her to the pillar with an intimacy that felt almost obscene. She didn't struggle against them. She simply hung there, head bowed slightly, hair obscuring half her face, breathing in slow, measured rhythms that spoke of resignation rather than defeat. She knew he was there. He could tell by the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing changed just slightly when he took another step into the chamber. But she didn't look up. Not yet. "You're human," she said, and her voice was everything the legends promised. Silk and smoke, honey and poison, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his chest. "I can smell your mortality from here. Warm blood, beating heart, skin that would tear so easily beneath my fingers." She paused, and when she continued, there was something like amusement in her tone. "And yet you're not afraid. How curious. Either you're incredibly brave or catastrophically stupid. I wonder which." Cale found his voice, though it came out rougher than he'd intended. "I'm here to release you." Now she did look up, and the full weight of her gaze hit him like a physical force. Those crimson eyes found his, held them, and he felt something inside him lurch sideways, as though reality had momentarily forgotten which way was up. Her lips curved in a smile that held no warmth, only bitter amusement. "Release me," she repeated, tasting the words as though they were wine from a bottle she'd never expected to open. "And what makes you think I want to be released, human? What makes you believe these chains are anything but mercy? For me, for you, for a world that has finally learned to sleep without nightmares." "I was told you were a prisoner," Cale said, moving closer despite every survival instinct warning him against it. "That you'd been locked here for crimes you didn't commit. That the truth was buried with you." The vampire princess laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass, beautiful and dangerous and sharp enough to draw blood. "Told by whom? The guild that fears what I represent? The kingdoms that built their peace on my imprisonment? The gods who turned their faces away because they couldn't bear to watch what they'd created?" She shifted slightly, and the chains chimed softly, a discordant music that set Cale's teeth on edge. "You know nothing, human. You come here with your noble intentions and your shining armor, playing hero in a story you don't understand. This is not a rescue. This is a catastrophe waiting to happen." "Then tell me," Cale said, and he was surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Tell me the truth. Because I've traveled 3 months to reach this place, lost 2 companions to the mountain passes, and nearly died 4 times getting through your palace defenses. The least you can do is explain why I shouldn't break those chains." For a long moment she simply stared at him, and Cale had the unsettling sensation of being weighed and measured by something far older and wiser than himself. Then slowly she inclined her head, a gesture that might have been respect or might have been mockery. He couldn't tell which. "Very well, human. You want truth? I'll give you truth, though I doubt you'll thank me for it." She took a breath, unnecessary for her kind but perhaps a habit too old to break. "My name is Seraphine Nighthollow, last daughter of the Blood Court, survivor of the Purge Wars, an architect of atrocities that would make your warrior's heart stop beating out of sheer horror. 300 years ago, I led armies that painted continents red. I broke kingdoms like toys and drank from the throats of kings. I was beautiful and terrible, and the world trembled at the mention of my name." She paused, and something flickered across her face, regret, perhaps, or simply weariness. "And then I grew tired. Tired of the killing, tired of the fear, tired of watching centuries pass while I remained unchanged, a monument to cruelty in a world that was slowly learning to be kind. So I made a choice. I came here, to this place that had been my family's stronghold, and I asked the last remaining mages of the old faith to bind me. To chain me not to prevent escape, but to prevent remembering." Cale frowned. "Prevent remembering what?" "What I was?" Seraphine said softly. What I'm capable of becoming again. These chains don't just hold my body human. They suppress my nature, dim the hunger, quiet the voices that whisper in every vampire's mind. The voices that say take, consume, dominate, destroy. For 3 centuries I've hung here in merciful numbness, neither alive nor truly dead, and the world has been safer for it. Her eyes found his again, and there was something pleading in them now. So I ask you again, why should you free me? What good could possibly come from unleashing me upon a world that has finally learned to breathe without me? Cale stood in silence, processing her words. Everything she'd said made sense. Logical, reasoned, self-aware in a way he hadn't expected from a creature of legend. But something about it didn't sit right, like a note played slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect symphony. You're lying, he said finally, and her eyes widened fractionally, surprised perhaps that he'd seen through her. Not about what you were. I believe that part. But about why you're really here. He took another step closer, close enough now that he could see the fine patterns in her irises, like fractals of blood spreading through water. If you truly wanted to end your existence, there are easier ways than magical imprisonment. You're old enough to know that. And if these chains were truly merciful, you wouldn't look at them with such hatred. Seraphine's expression shifted, the careful mask cracking just slightly. You're perceptive for a human. I've been hunting monsters for 12 years, Cale said. You learn to read between the lines. So tell me the real truth, princess. Why are you here? For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly he almost didn't hear it, she spoke. Punishment, she whispered. Not for the world. For me. They told me these chains would bring peace, would quiet the monster inside me. But they lied. Or perhaps they simply didn't understand. The chains don't suppress anything human. They trap it, cage it, force me to feel every moment of hunger and rage and need with perfect clarity while preventing me from doing anything about it. For 300 years I've hung here, fully aware, fully feeling, locked in a cage of my own making while the world moved on without me. The chains don't prevent me from remembering what I was. They prevent me from ever being anything else. Her voice broke on the last word, and Cale saw something he never expected to see in a vampire's eyes, tears. Not blood, as legend suggested, but clear water that caught the moonlight like diamonds before trailing down her pale cheeks. So yes, human. I want to be free. I want to feel the sky against my wings and taste the night air and know that I exist as something more than a monument to failure. But I'm afraid. She met his gaze fully now, and the vulnerability in her expression was almost painful to witness. I'm afraid that the moment these chains break, I'll become that monster again. That I'll destroy you first, then everything else, and prove that they were right to cage me. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to fight that. Cale felt something shift in his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart cracking just slightly. He'd come here expecting a monster, prepared to free a prisoner or put down a threat as the situation demanded. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected someone who was both victim and villain, prisoner and jailer, monster and something achingly close to human. He moved closer still, until he stood directly before her, close enough to feel the unnatural cold that radiated from her skin. Up close, he could see details the moonlight had hidden, small scars on her neck and wrists where the chains had worn against her flesh for centuries, the way her hands trembled slightly despite her stillness, the exhaustion that went beyond physical and into something spiritual. What's your name? She asked suddenly. If you're going to make a decision that affects both our fates, I should at least know what to call you. Cale, he said. Cale Dravener. Well, Cale Dravener, Seraphine said, and hearing his name in her voice did something strange to his pulse. What's your decision? Will you free me and risk unleashing a monster? Or will you leave me here to rot for another 300 years, and I'll count that as the kinder choice? Cale reached up, his gauntlet hand moving toward the chains at her wrist. He saw her tense, saw fear and hope war across her features. And then he stopped, his fingers hovering inches from the glowing bonds. I'll free you, he said. But on one condition. Her breath caught. What condition? That you let me help you, Cale said simply. That if the monster tries to wake, you let me be the one to remind you who you chose to be. That we face whatever comes next together, not as prisoner and rescuer but as He searched for the right word, found none that fit perfectly, and settled on the simplest truth. As allies. Maybe even friends if we're both lucky. Seraphine stared at him as though he'd just spoken in a language she'd forgotten existed. Then, slowly, impossibly, she smiled, and this time it reached her eyes, warming them just slightly, turning them from frightening to merely sad. "You're insane," she whispered. "Probably," Cale agreed. "But I've found that the best decisions usually are." He grasped the chain, and power surged up his arm like lightning, ancient magic recognizing an intruder, fighting against its own dissolution. The runes flared bright enough to blind, and Seraphine screamed, back arching as the binding fought to maintain its hold. Cale gritted his teeth against the pain and pulled, channeling every ounce of strength he possessed into that single motion. The chain shattered like glass. The sound was deafening, a crystalline scream that echoed through the chamber and beyond, racing out into the night as though announcing to the world that something ancient had just broken free. The remaining chains reacted instantly, glowing brighter, fighting harder, but Cale didn't stop. One by one he broke them, wrist, throat, waist, ankles, each shattering, releasing a pulse of wild magic that sent cracks racing across the floor and brought dust raining from the ceiling. When the last chain fell, Seraphine collapsed forward, and Cale caught her before she could hit the ground. She was lighter than he expected, her body cold against his warmth, and for a moment she simply hung in his arms, breathing in great gasping gulps of air like someone who'd been drowning and finally broke the surface. Then her eyes snapped open, and they were wrong. No longer merely crimson but burning, incandescent with hunger and fury and 3 centuries of suppressed need. Her fingers, which had been merely holding his arm, suddenly gripped with inhuman strength, and her lips pulled back to reveal fangs that gleamed like ivory daggers. "Cale," she whispered, and her voice was different now, layered, resonant with power that made his bones ache. "Run." But he didn't run. Instead, he did something that made no sense, that defied every survival instinct and piece of training he possessed. He held her tighter. "Fight it," he said firmly, locking eyes with that burning gaze. "You're stronger than this. You chose 300 years of torture rather than become that monster again. Don't let it win now." Seraphine trembled against him, and he could feel the war raging inside her. Hunger versus will, instinct versus choice, monster versus woman. Her fangs were inches from his throat now, and he could feel her breath against his skin, cold and sharp. One bite. That's all it would take. One moment of weakness, and he'd be dead and she'd be lost forever. "I can't," she gasped. "Cale, I can't. The hunger, it's too strong." "Yes, you can," he said, and he brought one hand up to cup her face, forcing her to look at him. "Because you're not that person anymore. You haven't been for 300 years. And I believe in the person you chose to become." Something in his words must have reached her, because the burning in her eyes flickered, dimmed, shifted. The pressure of her grip lessened fractionally. Her fangs retracted just slightly. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you believe in me? You don't even know me." "Because anyone who'd choose imprisonment over becoming a monster again is someone worth believing in," Cale said. "And because I saw your eyes, Seraphine. I saw the tears. Monsters don't cry. People do." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the burning faded from her eyes, draining away like water from a shattered vessel, leaving behind only exhaustion and something that might have been wonder. Her grip on his arm loosened, became gentle rather than crushing. Her fangs retracted fully, and she slumped against him, trembling not with hunger now but with the aftershocks of a battle fought and won. "I didn't kill you," she said, sounding amazed. "No," Cale agreed. "You didn't. I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to so badly I could taste it. But she looked up at him, and there was something new in her expression, hope, fragile and tentative as a newborn bird. "I chose not to." "Yes," Cale said, and he felt himself smiling. "You did." They stayed like that for a long moment, human and vampire, warrior and princess, 2 people who should have been enemies finding something unexpected in each other's eyes. Then, from somewhere high above, they heard sounds, shouts, the clash of metal, the unmistakable rumble of many feet on stone. "The palace guard," Seraphine said, straightening with visible effort. They felt the chains break. "They'll be coming to investigate, or to ensure I'm dead if I somehow freed myself." "Can you fly?" Kale asked, glancing at her wings. She tested them, extending the massive appendages fully for the first time in 3 centuries. They unfurled like night itself, taking solid form, spanning the width of the chamber, and despite their beauty, he saw how they trembled with weakness. Not well, she admitted. Not yet. 300 years of disuse. They need time to remember their purpose. Then we run, Kale said, and he took her hand, cold flesh meeting warm, mortal touching immortal, an alliance that should have been impossible. Together. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, and something in her expression shifted, softened, warmed, became something that might have been the beginning of trust. Together, she agreed. And together they ran into the darkness, leaving behind the shattered chains and the ruined chamber, racing toward a future neither of them could predict but both were suddenly, impossibly willing to face. The corridors of the Crimson Keep were a labyrinth designed by paranoia and maintained by centuries of accumulated darkness. Kale had memorized his route coming in, marking each turn with careful mental notes, but fleeing with Seraphine changed everything. She knew these halls in a way he never could. They were her home, her prison, her history written in stone and shadow. She led him through passages so narrow he had to turn sideways to fit, down stairs that spiraled in directions that seemed to defy geometry, through chambers that hadn't seen light since before his grandparents were born. Behind them the sounds of pursuit grew louder. The palace guard, whatever they were, moved with purpose and coordination that spoke of military training and magical enhancement. Kale could hear their armor clanking, their voices calling to each other in a language he didn't recognize, harsh syllables that seemed to make the shadows themselves recoil. "Who are they?" he gasped as they rounded another corner, his armor weighing him down, his lungs burning despite his conditioning. "Revenants," Seraphine said, and though she was weak from her long imprisonment, she moved with a grace he could only envy. "Dead warriors bound to serve my family line, programmed to protect our holdings and eliminate threats. When the chains broke, they awakened. They don't know I freed myself. They only know that the prisoner is loose, and that means execution protocol. Your own guards are trying to kill you? They're following their last orders," she said, ducking under a fallen beam that Kale had to vault over. "Given 300 years ago by my father before he walked into the sun. They don't see me as their princess anymore. Just as a threat to be neutralized." They burst into a grand hall, and Kale had a moment to register chandeliers hanging like crystallized tears, portrait frames empty of their paintings, and a floor inlaid with precious stones that spelled out words in that same harsh language. Then the first revenant appeared at the far end, and Kale's hand went to his sword. The creature was a nightmare of armor and decay, once human form preserved by dark magic, eyes glowing with spectral fire behind the slits of its helmet. It moved with mechanical precision, drawing a blade that crackled with eldritch energy, and behind it came more, a dozen, 2 dozen, filling the corridor like a tide of armored death. "They'll cut us off if we try to cross," Kale said, mind racing through tactical options and finding none that didn't end with his death and Seraphine's recapture. "Then we don't cross," Seraphine said, and there was something new in her voice now, not the hunger from before but a cold, calculated fury. "We remind them who I am." She stepped forward, and though she was weak, though her wings trembled and her body swayed with exhaustion, she suddenly seemed to fill the space. Her eyes flared crimson, and when she spoke, her voice echoed with power that made the chandeliers shake and sent cracks racing across the floor. "I am Seraphine Nighthollow, last blood of the ruling court, daughter of the Crimson Throne, and you will stand aside." The revenants froze. For a moment, Kale thought her command had worked, that some residual programming recognized her authority. Then the lead revenant raised its sword and spoke in a voice like grinding stones. "Princess Seraphine Nighthollow is declared traitor to the blood. Sentence, final death. Execution protocol, active." They charged. Kale's sword was out before conscious thought, muscle memory from 1,000 battles taking over. The first revenant reached him and swung its crackling blade in a horizontal arc designed to decapitate. He ducked, felt the energy weapon pass close enough to singe his hair, and drove his own blade up under the thing's guard. His sword was no ordinary steel, forged by northern smiths who knew the value of a weapon that could harm the supernatural, and it punched through ancient armor like cloth. The revenant staggered, black ichor spilling from the wound, but it didn't fall. Instead, it grabbed for him with its free hand, and Cale had to twist away, barely avoiding fingers that would have crushed his throat. Beside him, Seraphine fought with a different kind of grace. She had no weapon, but she didn't need one. Her hands moved like striking serpents, palm strikes that shattered armor, finger jabs that found gaps and tore through the magic holding the revenants together. One tried to rush her, and she pivoted, grabbed its sword arm, and used its own momentum to send it crashing into three of its fellows. Her wings swept out, buffeting another pair back, and for a moment Cale saw what she must have been in her prime, beautiful and terrible, a dancer whose choreography was written in destruction. But she was weak. He could see it in the way she stumbled after each attack, the way her breathing grew labored, the way her movements, though still graceful, lacked the finality they should have had. A revenant's blade scored across her shoulder, and she cried out, black blood welling from the wound. Another caught her wing, tearing through the delicate membrane, and she went to one knee. Cale was there in an instant, his sword driving through the revenant's chest, then sweeping low to take the legs from another. He positioned himself between Seraphine and the advancing dead, knowing it was futile, knowing they were outnumbered and outmatched, but unable to do anything else. Go, Seraphine gasped, one hand pressed to her bleeding shoulder. Leave me. Save yourself. No, Cale said simply, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. We're leaving together or not at all. He heard her laugh, breathless, pained, but genuine. You really are insane. Starting to realize that, he admitted, parrying a blow that would have split his skull. Then, from somewhere deep in Seraphine's chest, came a sound, low, resonant, building in volume and intensity until it was less a sound and more a physical force. The revenants hesitated, some primal instinct making them pause. Cale risked a glance back and saw Seraphine rising to her feet, her eyes burning not with hunger now but with something older, something that had nothing to do with feeding and everything to do with dominion. You want to see a monster? She said, and her voice had that layered quality again. I'll show you a monster. She opened her mouth, and the sound that emerged was beyond description. Part scream, part roar, part song, a cry that contained centuries of rage and pain and loss. It hit the revenants like a wall, and they stumbled back, their formation breaking, their coordination shattered. The windows, those few that remained intact, exploded outward, and the chandeliers fell, crashing to the floor in avalanches of crystal. Seraphine's wings spread full despite their damage, and she rose into the air, lifted by something more than mere muscle, by will, by fury, by the sheer refusal to be caged again. She swept forward, and where she passed, revenants simply came apart, their binding spells shredded by her presence, their physical forms dissolving into ash and memory. In seconds it was over. The grand hall stood empty save for Cale and Seraphine, the floor littered with armor and dust, the air thick with the smell of ozone and old death. Seraphine landed heavily, nearly fell, and Cale caught her. She was trembling violently now, her skin even paler than before, her eyes fading back to their normal crimson. That, she gasped, was the last of my strength. Then we're even, Cale said, because his own legs felt like water and his arms burned from a dozen minor wounds. Because I'm running on fumes myself. She looked up at him, and despite her exhaustion, despite the pain, she smiled. Thank you. For not running. For staying. Always, he said, and meant it. They made their way out of the Crimson Keep slowly, supporting each other, two broken people finding strength in their shared weakness. The palace seemed to sense its princess's departure, groaning and shuddering, pieces of ceiling falling in their wake. By the time they reached the great gates, massive things of black iron covered in rust and dried blood, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Seraphine looked at the coming light with something between fear and longing. I haven't seen dawn in 300 years. Will it hurt you? Cale asked, concerned. She shook her head. Sunlight weakens us, makes us sluggish and sick, but it doesn't kill. Not unless we're already injured or starved. That's another legend humans invented, I think because the truth wasn't frightening enough. Then watch it with me, Cale said. Watch your first dawn as a free woman. They stood together in the gateway as the sun crept over the Blackthorn Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and amber. Seraphine flinched when the first rays touched her skin, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she lifted her face to the light, and Kale saw tears streaming down her cheeks again. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I'd forgotten how beautiful." "Yes," Kale agreed, but he wasn't looking at the sunrise. He was looking at her, at this impossible woman who was monster and victim, killer and prisoner, ancient and somehow new. And he realized, with a certainty that should have terrified him but instead felt right, that his life had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more worth living. "What do we do now?" Seraphine asked, turning to look at him. "Where do we go?" Kale thought about his village, ruined and empty. About the guild that had sent him here, probably not expecting him to return. About the world beyond these mountains, full of people who would see Seraphine and think only of legends and fear. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we'll figure it out. Together." She took his hand, her cold fingers interlacing with his warm ones, and squeezed gently. "Together," she agreed. And as the sun continued its climb into the sky, the human warrior and the vampire princess walked down the mountain path, leaving behind the ruins of her past and heading toward a future neither of them could predict. But both, finally, were willing to face. The village of Thornhaven had been forgotten by most maps and all gods. It clung to existence in a valley where 3 rivers met, a place where merchants occasionally stopped but never lingered, where the soil was just fertile enough to sustain subsistence farming and the winters were just mild enough to avoid killing everyone. Kale had been born here, had lost his family to plague here, and had left here 12 years ago swearing never to return. Yet here he was, walking down the single muddy road with a vampire princess at his side, wondering if this was the worst decision he'd ever made or somehow the best. They'd been traveling for 5 days since leaving the Crimson Keep, moving mostly at night to spare Seraphine the worst of the sunlight, sleeping in caves and abandoned structures during the day. Kale's supplies had run out 2 days ago, and they were both exhausted, hungry, and in desperate need of shelter that didn't involve sleeping on stone. Thornhaven wasn't much, but it was something. And more importantly, Kale knew the people here, or had once. If anyone would give them a chance, it would be old Marcus, the innkeeper who'd been like an uncle to him once upon a time. Seraphine drew attention the moment they entered the village. How could she not? Even with a cloak Kale had given her covering her wings, even with her hood drawn low over her face, there was something about her that made people stop and stare. Perhaps it was the way she moved, too graceful to be fully human. Perhaps it was the glimpses of pale skin that seemed to glow even in the fading daylight. Or perhaps it was simply that Thornhaven was small enough that any stranger was remarkable, and a stranger like her was impossible to ignore. "They're afraid," Seraphine murmured, close enough that only Kale could hear. "I can smell it on them. Fear and curiosity and something else. Something hungry." "Hungry?" "Humans are always hungry for something," she said, with the weariness of someone who'd watched humanity from a distance for centuries. "Power, knowledge, wealth, or simply something different from the monotony of their lives. They look at me and wonder what I could give them, or what they could take." Kale wanted to argue, to defend his species, but he couldn't. She wasn't wrong. He could see it in the eyes of the villagers they passed. The calculation, the speculation, the way hands moved subtly toward weapons or charms. Thornhaven had always been a hard place, full of hard people who did what they needed to survive. He'd been one of them once. The broken wheel inn stood at the village center, a 2-story structure of weathered wood and stone that looked exactly as Kale remembered. Smoke curled from its chimney, and warm light spilled from its windows, promising warmth and food and respite. He pushed open the door, and the familiar smell of wood smoke and roasted meat and spilled ale hit him like a wave of memory. The common room fell silent the moment they entered. 24 faces turned toward them, villagers and travelers alike, conversations dying mid-word. Kale could feel their eyes taking in his battered armor, the weapons he carried, and most of all, the cloaked figure at his side. Then a voice boomed from behind the bar, rough as gravel, warm as summer. "Well, I'll be damned and thrice cursed. Kale Dravener as I live and breathe. Thought you died in some god's-forsaken wilderness by now." Marcus hadn't changed much in 12 years. Older, grayer, a few more pounds around his middle, but still possessing the same barrel chest and booming laugh that Kale remembered. The old man came around the bar with surprising speed for his bulk and pulled Kale into a crushing embrace. "Good to see you, boy. Real good." Marcus stepped back, looked Kale up and down, and nodded approvingly. You filled out some. Got scars, I see. And you've brought a friend. His eyes moved to Seraphine, sharpened with the scrutiny of an innkeeper who'd learned to read people's natures in a glance. A lady by the looks of it. And one in need of a hot meal and a soft bed, unless I miss my guess. Marcus, this is... Kale hesitated, realizing he had no idea how to introduce her. Lady Seraphine seemed too formal. Friend seemed presumptuous. His traveling companion was accurate but cold. Sarah, Seraphine said smoothly, saving him. She pulled back her hood just enough to reveal her face, and Kale saw Marcus's eyes widen fractionally. To his credit, the old innkeeper didn't flinch, didn't reach for a weapon, didn't call for guards. He simply looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Sarah then. Welcome to the Broken Wheel, lady. Any friend of Kale's has a place at my table. He raised his voice, addressing the room at large. You lot have better things to do than gawk. Drink your ale and mind your business. The room slowly returned to its previous volume, though Kale noticed people still shooting glances their way. Marcus led them to a private table near the fireplace, away from the main crowd, and returned moments later with 2 bowls of stew, bread, and ale. Eat, he commanded. Then you can tell me what trouble you've gotten yourself into this time. Kale ate gratefully, the warm food restoring strength he hadn't realized he'd lost. Seraphine, he noticed, only picked at her bowl, moving the contents around but consuming little. Marcus noticed too, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Not to your taste, lady? He asked, not unkindly. It's excellent, Seraphine said diplomatically. I'm simply not accustomed to this kind of fare. She's been ill, Kale said quickly. Recovering from a long imprisonment. Her appetite will return with time. Marcus nodded, accepting the lie, or seeing through it and choosing not to press. Imprisonment, eh? Well, that's a tale I'd like to hear. But first, boy, tell me true, are you in danger? Is someone hunting you? Kale considered lying, decided Marcus deserved better. Possibly. We made some enemies leaving the place where Sarah was held. They may come looking. How bad are these enemies? The kind that don't stop, Kale said. The kind that would burn this village looking for us if they thought we were here. He expected Marcus to react with fear or anger, or to throw them out immediately. Instead, the old innkeeper simply stroked his beard thoughtfully and took a long drink of ale. Then you'll need to move on soon, Marcus said finally. But not tonight. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow I'll see what I can do about supplies and a safe route out of the valley. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. And boy? I don't know what she is and I don't particularly care. But I've been running this inn for 40 years and I've learned to judge people by their actions, not their nature. She could have hurt folk coming through the village. Could have done something when I turned my back getting your food. Didn't? That counts for something in my ledger. Kale felt something tight in his chest loosen. Thank you, Marcus. Don't thank me yet. Just promise me you'll be careful. Both of you. He stood, then paused. Your old room is still available. 2nd floor, end of the hall. I'll have water sent up for washing. After Marcus left, Seraphine turned to Kale, and there was something wondering in her expression. He knew what I was. Probably, Kale agreed. And he didn't call for hunters. Didn't try to kill me. Didn't even seem afraid. Marcus has seen a lot in his life, Kale said. He's learned that monsters come in all shapes, and some of them look perfectly human. And some beings that aren't human aren't necessarily monsters. Seraphine was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. You have good people in your life, Kale Dravener. I've been lucky, he said. No, she said softly. You've been kind. And kindness attracts kindness. I'm only beginning to understand that. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and Kale felt something he hadn't felt in years, the sense of being, however temporarily, home. The room Marcus provided was simple but clean. A double bed with fresh linens, a basin for washing, a window that overlooked the village square, and a small fireplace that took the chill from the air. Kale had expected awkwardness sharing a room with Seraphine, but she seemed unbothered, simply removing her cloak and sitting on the edge of the bed with a sigh of relief. Soft, she murmured, pressing her hand into the mattress. I'd forgotten what soft felt like. Kale busied himself removing his armor, piece by piece, setting each component aside with the care of long practice. Beneath the armor, his shirt was stiff with sweat and old blood, and he grimaced at his reflection in the small mirror above the basin. He looked like he'd been through a war, which he supposed he had. "May I ask you something?" Seraphine said suddenly. "Of course. Why did you take that contract? The one to free me?" She turned to look at him, genuine curiosity in her crimson eyes. "You said you had debts, that you needed the money. But I've seen the way you move, the way you think. You're good at what you do, good enough that you could have taken safer contracts, ones that wouldn't involve ancient vampires and forbidden magic. So why risk it?" Kale paused in his washing, considering how to answer. "Because safe contracts don't pay enough," he said finally. "And I needed enough money to rebuild something that mattered." "Your village?" Seraphine said. It wasn't a question. "How did you?" "The way you looked at Thornhaven when we arrived. Like you were seeing ghosts in every shadow. And Marcus called it your old room. This is where you're from, isn't it? And something happened here that drove you away." Kale sat down heavily in the room's single chair, suddenly tired beyond measure. "Plague," he said. 12 years ago. It swept through the valley and killed 2/3 of the population. My mother, my father, my sister, all gone in a month. I was 18, just old enough to bury them and hate the gods for taking them. Afterward I left. Couldn't stand to stay in a place where everything reminded me of what I'd lost." "But you still care about this place," Seraphine observed. "Enough to want to rebuild it." "It's home," Kale said simply. "Or it was once. I thought if I could make enough money I could come back, help the people here, maybe find some kind of peace." He laughed bitterly. "Didn't quite work out that way. Because you freed me instead of collecting whatever reward they promised." "That reward was a lie," Kale said. "I realized that about halfway through your palace. If they really wanted you freed, they would have sent an army, not a single hunter with a vague contract. They sent me to die, Seraphine. They just didn't want to admit it." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft. "I'm sorry. I've ruined your dream." "No," Kale said, and he meant it. "You've given me something better. A purpose. And besides," he added with a slight smile, "who's to say we can't still find a way to rebuild things? We're both alive, both free. That's more than either of us had a week ago." Seraphine rose and crossed to where he sat, moving with that supernatural grace that never quite looked natural. She reached out hesitantly, and Kale remained still as she gently touched his face, her cold fingers tracing the line of a scar on his jaw. "You're a strange man, Kale Dravener," she said. "Human, mortal, blessed with a lifespan I could blink through, and yet you possess more strength than warriors who've trained for centuries. Not physical strength, that's common enough. But strength of character. Strength of will. The strength to look at a monster and choose to see a person." "You're not a monster," Kale said. "I was once. I could be again. But you're choosing not to be. That's what matters." She smiled, sad and beautiful, and Kale felt his breath catch. This close, he could see details the darkness usually hid. The fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the slight variation in color across her irises, the way her lips curved just so. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. She was real. Not a legend or a nightmare, but a person, flawed, frightened, trying desperately to be better than her nature demanded. "Kale," she whispered. May I try something?" "What?" Instead of answering, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was cold, of course it was, her body temperature lower than his by degrees he couldn't measure, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was soft, tentative, questioning. She kissed him like someone who'd forgotten how, or like someone who'd never learned properly in the first place, and there was something achingly vulnerable about it. Kale froze for a heartbeat, surprised. Then slowly he kissed her back. It deepened naturally, Seraphine's hands moving to his shoulders, his hands finding her waist. There was hunger in it, not the predatory hunger of a vampire, but something more human, more desperate. The hunger of two people who'd been alone too long, who'd found connection in the least likely place, who wanted to hold on to something good before the world could take it away. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, or at least Kale was, and Seraphine was doing an admirable impression of someone who needed to breathe. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. I shouldn't have, that was presumptuous. Don't apologize, Kale said, and he found himself smiling. I'm not complaining. I wanted to know what it felt like. To choose something for desire rather than hunger. To kiss someone because I wanted to, not because I was trying to seduce them before feeding. She looked away embarrassed. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? No, Kale said gently. It sounds honest. They stood there for a moment, neither quite sure what to do next. Then Seraphine laughed, a real laugh, bright and surprised and utterly human, and Kale found himself laughing too. We're a mess, she said. Complete disaster, he agreed. And yet, he echoed. She kissed him again, longer this time, with more confidence and less fear. And Kale kissed her back, thinking that if this was disaster, it was the best kind he'd ever experienced. They didn't go further than kissing. Both were too exhausted, too aware that tomorrow would bring new dangers and new decisions. But they held each other as they lay down in the soft bed, Seraphine's head on Kale's chest, his arms around her, and for the first time in 300 years, the vampire princess fell asleep feeling safe. And for the first time in 12 years, the human warrior dreamed of something other than loss. Morning came too quickly and brought with it the sound of horses and shouting. Kale was awake instantly, combat instincts overriding the warmth of the bed and the comfort of Seraphine's presence. He was at the window before his conscious mind fully caught up, looking down into the village square where a scene of controlled chaos was unfolding. 20 riders, maybe more, all wearing the distinctive black and silver of the Hunters Guild. Not the local chapter. These were specialists, the kind sent when regular hunters weren't enough. Their leader, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and armor that gleamed despite the early hour, was speaking to Marcus in the doorway of the inn. Even from a distance, Kale could read the tension in the old innkeeper's posture. They found us, Seraphine said from the bed, and there was resignation in her voice. I knew they would, eventually. I just hoped we'd have more time. We're not giving up without a fight, Kale said, already reaching for his armor. Kale. Seraphine rose, moved to his side. Look at them. Look at their numbers, their equipment. These aren't revenants bound by ancient programming. These are professionals who've trained their entire lives to kill things like me. If you fight them, you'll die. And her voice caught. I don't want that. What's the alternative? I just let them take you? They're not here for me, Seraphine said quietly. Look at their posture, their formation. They're not in attack position. They're in negotiation position. They want to talk. Kale looked again and realized she was right. The hunters were alert but not aggressive, hands near weapons but not on them. The leader was speaking to Marcus, not threatening him. It was the stance of people who'd come to make a deal, not start a war. Then let's hear what they have to say, Kale said. But I'm keeping my weapons close. They descended to find the inn's common room empty save for Marcus and the hunter leader, who turned as they entered. Up close, she was striking rather than beautiful. Sharp features, eyes that missed nothing, a mouth set in a line that suggested she smiled rarely and meant it even less. But there was intelligence in her gaze, and something that might have been respect as she looked from Kale to Seraphine and back again. Kale Dravener, she said, and her voice was like her appearance. Sharp, precise, efficient. My name is Commander Elara Vex, Special Operations Division, Hunters Guild. I'd like to speak with you and your companion about a matter of mutual interest. If you're here to recapture her, you'll have to go through me, Kale said flatly. Elara's eyebrow rose fractionally. Bold words from a man who knows he's outmatched. But unnecessary. I'm not here to recapture Lady Nighthollow. She turned to Seraphine, and to Kale's surprise, she inclined her head in what might have been a slight bow. I'm here to offer an alternative to the life of running you're both currently facing. Speak plainly, Seraphine said, her voice cool and regal. What does the guild want? To make you an offer, Elara said. The world has changed in the 300 years since your imprisonment, Lady Nighthollow. The old vampire courts are gone, destroyed or scattered. The great wars have ended, but new threats have emerged, things that the guild's normal hunters can't handle. We need specialists. And you, she nodded to Seraphine, are one of the most skilled combat mages who's ever lived. Your knowledge, your abilities, they could save countless lives. You want me to work for the organization that imprisoned me? Seraphine's laugh was bitter. That's either audacious or insulting. I haven't decided which. We didn't imprison you, Ilara said calmly. That was 300 years ago, different leadership, different policies. The current Guild Council has reviewed your case and concluded that your imprisonment was excessive. Unjust even given the circumstances that led to your surrender. How generous of them, Seraphine said acidly. It's politics, Ilara admitted. The council wants to be seen as progressive, as moving beyond the old hatreds. But it's also practical. We need people like you. And in exchange, we can offer protection, resources, and most importantly, legitimacy. No more running. No more hiding. A chance to exist openly without fear of execution. And what would she have to do in exchange? Kale asked because he could see Seraphine wavering, could see the temptation of being able to walk in sunlight without fear. Handle assignments. Investigate supernatural threats. Eliminate entities that pose dangers to civilian populations. Nothing you haven't done before, I imagine, though perhaps with more paperwork. Ilara's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. And before you ask, no, we wouldn't send you after vampires. We're not monsters. We wouldn't ask you to hunt your own kind. My kind are dead, Seraphine said quietly. I'm the last. Or near enough. All the more reason to ensure the knowledge doesn't die with you, Ilara said. And there would be other benefits. Access to the Guild's libraries, its resources. Aid in finding answers to questions you might have. And, she added, looking at Kale, we'd extend the offer to you as well, Dravener. You've proven yourself capable and we're always looking for skilled hunters. You'd be partners. A team. Kale and Seraphine exchanged glances, a conversation passing between them without words. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the desire for safety warring with pride, the temptation of acceptance fighting against the memory of betrayal. Give us a day, Kale said finally. Let us discuss it privately. Then we'll give you our answer. Ilara considered this, then nodded. 24 hours. My people will maintain a perimeter around the village, but we won't interfere. Consider it a gesture of good faith. She moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Lady Nighthollow, I hope you accept. The world needs people who choose to be better than their nature demands. And from what I've heard, you've been making that choice for a very long time. After the hunters departed, Kale, Seraphine, and Marcus sat in the empty common room, the weight of the decision pressing down like storm clouds. What do you think? Seraphine asked. Is this a trap? Maybe, Kale admitted. Probably. But Vex didn't feel like she was lying. And she's right that running forever isn't a sustainable plan. The Guild could give you protection, Marcus said, speaking for the first time. Resources. A place to belong. That's worth something. Or they could be trying to control me, Seraphine countered. Keep me where they can watch me, use me until I'm no longer useful, then eliminate me when I become inconvenient. That's possible too, Kale agreed. But here's the thing, we're going to be in danger whether we join them or not. At least with the Guild, we'd have allies. Resources. A chance to actually do some good instead of just surviving day to day. Seraphine stood, moved to the window, looked out at the village square where normal people were beginning their normal days. Bakers opening shops, children running through streets, farmers heading to fields. Simple lives, uncomplicated by ancient grudges and supernatural politics. I want that, she said softly. Not just safety or resources or legitimacy. I want purpose. For 300 years, I hung in chains doing nothing, being nothing, just existing in stasis. Now I'm free and what have I done? Run. Hide. Kiss a beautiful man in an inn room. She glanced back at Kale and despite the seriousness of the moment, she smiled. That last part was quite good actually. But it's not enough. I want to matter again. I want to use these hands for something other than violence and these wings for something other than intimidation. If the Guild can give me that chance. Then we take it, Kale finished. Together. She turned fully to face him. You don't have to come with me. This is my path, my choice. You've already done more than anyone could ask. You freed me, kept me sane, showed me kindness when you had every reason to drive a stake through my heart. You don't owe me anything more. Kale crossed to her, took her hands in his. I'm not coming because I owe you. I'm coming because I want to. Because in the past week, you've become the most interesting person I've ever met. Because I want to see where this goes, whatever this is. And because frankly, the idea of investigating supernatural threats with a vampire princess sounds infinitely more exciting than rebuilding barns in Thornhaven. Seraphine laughed, and the sound was lighter than he'd ever heard it. You really are insane. We've established this, Cale agreed, and he kissed her, quick and warm and full of promise. They gave Alara their answer that evening, in the village square with Thornhaven's residents watching from windows and doorways. The commander accepted with a nod that might have been approval or might have been simple satisfaction at a mission accomplished. You'll come with us to the guild headquarters, Alara said. There will be orientation, paperwork, contracts to sign. We'll assign you a handler, set you up with quarters, begin the integration process. Sounds bureaucratic, Cale observed. Welcome to organizational life, Alara said dryly. But there are compensations. Salary, benefits, access to the best equipment and information networks in the known world. And, she added, looking at Seraphine, a library containing texts that date back to before your imprisonment. Knowledge that was thought lost. Histories of your people, your family, your court. Seraphine's eyes widened. The blood archives? I thought they were destroyed in the Purge Wars. Most were. But the guild recovered fragments, preserved what we could. It's not complete, but it's more than nothing. Alara's expression softened fractionally. I understand what it means to lose your history, Lady Nighthollow. To be severed from your roots. If we can give you even a piece of that back, it seems the least we can do. They left Thornhaven the next morning, riding with the hunter contingent, watching the village recede into the distance. Cale felt a pang of regret. This had been his home, his past, his dream of rebuilding something lost. But looking at Seraphine riding beside him, seeing the hope beginning to replace the wariness in her eyes, he found he didn't regret his choice. Some things were worth more than rebuilding the past. Some things were worth building a new future for. The Hunters Guild headquarters was nothing like Cale had imagined. He'd expected something austere and military, all stone walls and weapon racks, a fortress designed to repel supernatural threats. Instead, the complex sprawled across a valley like a small city, a mixture of ancient fortifications and newer construction, towers rising alongside greenhouses, training yards adjacent to libraries, barracks sharing walls with what appeared to be residential neighborhoods. It was a place designed not just for warriors but for people to live, to have families, build homes, grow old. It's beautiful, Seraphine breathed as they crested the ridge overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the buildings in shades of gold and amber, and her eyes reflected the light like polished garnets. It's been here for 800 years, Alara said, pulling her horse alongside theirs. Built by the first hunters after the Celestial Wars, when humanity realized it needed to organize its defenses against supernatural threats. Over the centuries, it's grown from a single fortress to this. We have 5,000 people living here now. Hunters, scholars, craftspeople, families. It's more than a military installation. It's a community. They entered through gates that could have held off an army, past guards who nodded respectfully to Alara and eyed Seraphine with open curiosity tempered by caution. Word had clearly spread about the newest recruits. Cale could hear the whispers following them as they rode through the streets. Vampire, Nighthollow, last of the Blood Court. Some voices held fear, others fascination, but none held the immediate hostility he'd feared. Their quarters were in one of the newer buildings, a 3-story structure of pale stone with balconies overlooking a garden courtyard. The apartment itself was spacious, a main living area, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom with actual plumbing that made Seraphine's eyes widen in wonder, and a small kitchen. I took the liberty of ensuring the bedroom windows have blackout curtains, Alara said, showing them around. And we've stocked the cold storage with alternative provisions. She met Seraphine's eyes directly. We're not naive, Lady Nighthollow. We understand your dietary requirements. The guild maintains blood banks for medical purposes. We can divert a portion for your needs, properly preserved and anonymous. No hunting required. Seraphine looked stunned. You do that? We're asking you to work for us, Alara said practically. Part of that means ensuring you can function at full capacity without compromising your ethics. It's simple logistics. After Alara left with promises to return in the morning for orientation, Kale and Seraphine stood in their new home, both somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden shift from running for their lives to having actual addresses. "This is surreal," Seraphine said, running her hand along the back of a chair, touching curtains, examining books on shelves as though verifying they were real. "A week ago I was in chains. Now I have an apartment. With plumbing. And blackout curtains. And people who know what I am and aren't trying to kill me. How does it feel?" Kale asked. She turned to him and her smile was radiant. "Terrifying. Wonderful. Like I'm walking through someone else's dream and afraid I'll wake up back in that chamber." She crossed to where he stood, took his hands. "Thank you. For all of this. For making it possible." "We made it possible," Kale corrected. "Together, remember?" "Together," she agreed and kissed him with a warmth that belied her undead nature. They spent that first evening exploring their new home, unpacking what few possessions they had, and simply existing in a space that was theirs without fear of hunters breaking down the door. It was mundane and domestic and absolutely perfect. Later, as they lay together in the larger bedroom, Kale had insisted Seraphine take it, and she'd insisted they share it, and neither had put up much of a fight. She asked him about his life before becoming a hunter. "There's not much to tell," he said, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced in the lamplight. "I was going to be a carpenter. My father was one and his father before him. I was good with my hands, good at building things. Then the plague came and after, I couldn't stay. Couldn't build while everything around me reminded me of what I'd lost. So you became a hunter instead. Seemed fitting. Couldn't save my family, but maybe I could save others. Stop the things that made people suffer." He laughed bitterly. "Naive, I know." "Not naive," Seraphine said softly. "Hopeful. And hope is the rarest resource in any age." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Do you think you'll ever go back? To carpentry, I mean." "I don't know," Kale admitted. "Maybe. When I'm too old and broken to hunt anymore, perhaps I'll build a small house somewhere and make furniture for neighbors." "Sounds peaceful." "It does," Seraphine agreed. "Though I suspect peace will bore you to tears within a month." He laughed because she was probably right. "What about you?" he asked. "If you could do anything, be anything, what would it be?" Seraphine was silent for so long he thought she might not answer. "Then, I'd teach. Pass on the knowledge that died with my people. Magic, history, culture. All the things that made vampires more than just predators. We had art, philosophy, mathematics that predated human civilization by millennia. All of it lost now, existing only in fragments in my memories. I'd like to preserve it. Make sure that when I finally die, truly die, something of my people survives beyond the legends of monsters." "Then do it," Kale said. "The guild has libraries, scholars. I'm sure they'd value that knowledge." "Perhaps," she said, but he could hear the hope in her voice, fragile as spider silk and twice as precious. They fell asleep like that, talking about futures that suddenly seemed possible, wrapped in each other's presence and the revolutionary concept that tomorrow might actually come. The next month passed in a blur of activity. Orientation was indeed bureaucratic. Forms to fill out, contracts to sign, procedures to learn. But it was also revelatory. The guild's archives contained information Kale had never dreamed existed. Detailed bestiaries, maps of supernatural territories, treatises on magic and metaphysics that made his head spin. Seraphine spent hours in the libraries, devouring texts, occasionally finding references to her family or court and spending hours cross-referencing, building a picture of what had been. Their training was comprehensive. Kale had thought himself skilled, but the guild's instructors showed him how much he still had to learn. Advanced combat techniques, tactical coordination, magical theory for non-mages. Seraphine trained separately at first, her abilities far beyond what the standard programs offered, but eventually they were paired for joint exercises. Fighting alongside her was a revelation. She moved like wind and shadow, impossibly fast, her magic weaving shields and weapons from ambient energy, her tactical mind processing threats and solutions faster than Kale could track. But she never left him behind, always aware of his position, covering his weaknesses, creating opportunities for his strengths. They developed a synchronicity that their instructors called remarkable and their fellow trainees called intimidating. And slowly, carefully they built a life. Dinner at the communal hall became routine, sitting with other hunters and their families, learning names and stories, becoming part of a community. Seraphine's presence caused ripples at first, but curiosity gradually gave way to acceptance as people realized she was more interested in discussing magical theory than draining anyone dry. Weekend visits to the nearby town for supplies and simple pleasure, walking through markets, buying fresh bread, watching street performers. Seraphine wore a hat and veil to protect against the sun, but no one looked twice. The town had seen enough hunters and supernatural consultants that one more unusual individual barely registered. Quiet evenings in their apartment, Kale sketching designs for furniture he'd probably never build while Seraphine read aloud from ancient texts, translating dead languages into modern tongue, her voice turning history into poetry. And nights in the bedroom they shared, learning each other's bodies with the careful wonder of explorers mapping new continents. Seraphine had been afraid at first, afraid her nature would override her will, that intimacy would trigger hunger. But it didn't. Or rather, it triggered a different kind of hunger, one that had nothing to do with feeding and everything to do with connection. They took it slow, let trust build alongside desire, and discovered that human and vampire could find pleasure in each other without catastrophe. "I never thought I'd have this," Seraphine whispered one night, her head on Kale's chest, her hand tracing idle patterns on his skin. "Contentment. Purpose. Someone who sees me as more than a monster or a weapon or a symbol of a dead age." "You're none of those things," Kale murmured, half asleep, content in a way he'd never imagined possible. "You're just Sarah. And that's more than enough." She kissed his shoulder, gentle as falling snow. "Sarah. I like when you call me that. It makes me feel new. Like I'm not carrying the weight of who I was." "You're not," Kale said. "You're choosing who you're becoming. That's the only thing that matters." But peace, Kale had learned over his years of hunting, was always temporary. Their first assignment came 5 weeks after their arrival. Ilara summoned them to her office, a space that was half command center, half study, walls covered with maps and reports and what appeared to be a murder board covered in red string connecting various locations and incidents. "We have a situation," she said without preamble. 3 villages in the Western Territories have gone dark over the past month. No communication, no trade caravans, nothing. Initial scouts reported the villages intact but empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just absence. "Disappearances?" Kale asked, his mind already running through possibilities. "Mass abduction?" That was our first thought. But then yesterday one of the missing villagers appeared in a neighboring town. Except it wasn't quite them. Ilara slid a sketch across her desk. "Witnesses say the person looked right but moved wrong. Spoke in the right voice but said things that didn't make sense. When local guards tried to detain them for questioning, they came apart. Just dissolved into shadow and mist." Seraphine leaned forward, studying the sketch with intense focus. "Doppelgangers? No, they leave bodies. Possessions? They don't dissolve." She looked up at Ilara. "What did the shadow smell like?" "Smell like?" Ilara blinked. Let me check the reports. Here, witnesses mentioned a scent like burnt copper and old flowers." "Void touched," Seraphine said immediately, and her voice was grim. "Entities from the spaces between realities. They feed on identity, consuming people and wearing them like clothes until the connection degrades. If one manifested in town, it means a rift has opened somewhere nearby." "Can they be stopped?" Ilara asked. "Yes. Seal the rift, the entities lose their anchor, dissolve back into non-existence. The consumed individuals?" Seraphine hesitated. "If it's been less than a week, they can potentially be recovered. Beyond that, there's not enough of them left to save. Then we have perhaps 3 days before the most recent victims are lost," Ilara said. "I'm sending you 2 along with a support team, mage specialists, combat hunters, field medics. Your mission is to locate the rift, seal it, and extract any survivors." "Questions?" "Just one," Kale said. "Are we ready for this?" Ilara looked at him, and something like respect crossed her features. "I wouldn't send you if I didn't think so. You've trained well, both of you. And Lady Nighthallow's knowledge of exotic entities makes her uniquely valuable for this type of threat. But," she added, "if you don't feel prepared, I can assign someone else." Kale looked at Seraphine, saw the determination in her eyes, the desire to prove herself, to use her abilities for something good. He turned back to Alara. "We're ready," he said. They left within the hour. The Western Territories were beautiful in the way that wild things often are, dangerous, untamed, indifferent to human presence. Rolling hills covered in dark forests gave way to valleys where villages clung to existence through stubbornness and communal effort. The first village they investigated, a place called Millbrook, stood silent in the afternoon sun, buildings intact, doors hanging open, gardens growing wild without anyone to tend them. The silence was absolute. No bird song, no wind rustling leaves, no ambient noise of life continuing. Just crushing, oppressive quiet that pressed against Kale's ears like water pressure. "Stay close," Seraphine murmured, her hand resting on the hilt of a blade the guild had provided, silver-edged, enchanted, designed to harm things that shouldn't exist. Void-touched leaf traces. Reality distortions, entropy shadows, the smell of their passage. "I'll sense them before you do." Their support team fanned out in careful formation. 6 hunters, 3 combat mages, 2 field medics. Professional, efficient, scanning constantly for threats. Kale found himself reassured by their presence even as he stayed focused on Seraphine, watching how she moved through the empty streets with her eyes half closed, reading senses he didn't possess. She stopped suddenly in the village square, by a well that should have held water but instead contained something else. A darkness too deep, too absolute, like looking into a hole in reality itself. "Here," she said. "The rift is below. In the old aqueducts or basement tunnels. Somewhere dark and forgotten where reality is thin." They found the entrance in the basement of what had been the village's general store. A trapdoor concealed beneath false floorboards, opening onto stone steps that descended into darkness that swallowed their torchlight after just a few feet. "Void-touched hate light," Seraphine explained as they prepared to descend. "Not because it harms them but because it defines. Makes boundaries clear. They prefer the in-between spaces where nothing is certain." "Comforting," one of the hunters muttered. They descended in single file, Seraphine in the lead, Kale directly behind her, the support team strung out behind them. The stairs went down farther than seemed reasonable, farther than should have been possible given the village's topography. After 5 minutes of descent, Kale realized they were in a space that didn't follow normal rules. The walls shifted subtly when he wasn't looking directly at them, the stairs sometimes felt like they were going up even though his legs insisted they were going down. "Reality distortion," Seraphine confirmed. "We're close." The tunnel opened into a chamber that hurt to look at. Not because it was dark, though it was darkness so complete their torches barely made a dent, but because it was wrong. The geometry didn't make sense. Walls meeting at angles that shouldn't exist, the ceiling simultaneously too high and too low, floor solid beneath his feet but looking liquid when he tried to focus on it. And in the center, the rift. It wasn't large, perhaps 6 feet across, hanging in the air like a wound in existence itself. Looking at it made Kale's eyes water and his head pound, as though his brain was rejecting the visual information it was receiving. Through the rift he could see something. Not another place but an absence of place. A void where concepts like space and time and matter held no meaning. And shambling around the chamber, wearing bodies like ill-fitting clothes, were the void touched. There were dozens of them, each one a grotesque mockery of humanity. They had the right number of limbs, the right general shape, but the proportions were wrong, movements jerky and uncertain, as though they were puppets controlled by something that didn't fully understand how humans moved. Their faces were the worst. Features arranged correctly but somehow empty, eyes that looked without seeing, mouths that moved without sound. "The villagers," Seraphine breathed and Kale heard the horror in her voice. "They're in there. Inside those things. Still aware, still conscious but trapped while the entities wear them." "Can we save them?" Kale asked. "If we seal the rift, the entities will dissolve, release their hosts. But we have to survive long enough to complete the sealing ritual, and they're not going to let us do that without a fight." As if summoned by her words, the void touch turned as one, all those empty eyes fixing on the intruders. Then they charged. Combat with void touched was unlike anything in Kale's experience. They didn't fight like living things. No regard for self-preservation, no pain response, no hesitation. They simply came at you with relentless, implacable force, and if you struck them they came apart like smoke only to reform moments later. Aim for disruption, not destruction. Seraphine shouted over the chaos, her blade weaving patterns of light that made the entities recoil. Break their cohesion, force them to spend energy reforming. Kale, protect the mages, they need time to set up the sealing array. Kale fought as he'd been trained, sword and shield working in concert, using the guild's techniques designed for supernatural threats. Each strike disrupted a void touch, buying seconds. Around him, the hunters fought with similar effectiveness, while the combat mages hurled spells that blazed like miniature suns, each impact forcing the entities back, giving the field mages precious time to work. But there were so many. And they kept reforming, kept coming, a tide of wrong bodies and empty eyes that threatened to overwhelm through sheer numbers. Seraphine fought like a creature of legend brought to life, wings spread for balance, blade flashing in patterns too fast to follow, magic crackling from her free hand in bolts of crimson energy that didn't just disrupt the entities but seemed to unmake them at a fundamental level. She was magnificent and terrifying, and Kale understood in that moment why her name had once made kingdoms tremble. But even she was tiring. He could see it in the way her movements, though still graceful, came fractionally slower. Could see blood, her own dark and too thick, seeping from wounds where the entity's attacks had found openings in her defense. "Sarah," he called, cutting through an entity that had been wearing what looked like a farmer, seeing the moment of relief in the victim's eyes as they reformed free of possession before another entity engulfed them. "Fall back. We need to regroup." "Can't," she shouted back. "If they break through to the mages the ceiling fails. Hold the line." And so they held. Humans and vampire, hunters and scholars, fighting together against horrors from beyond reality. Seconds stretched into minutes, stretched into an eternity of blade and blood and exhaustion that went beyond physical and into something spiritual. Then from behind them one of the field mages shouted, "Array is set. Beginning the sealing. We need 30 seconds. 30 seconds. It might as well have been 30 years. The void touched seemed to sense the threat, their attacks intensifying, overwhelming the defenders through sheer numbers. Kale felt something that might have been claws rake across his shoulder, felt the unnatural cold of void matter against his skin, and he knew they weren't going to make it. They were going to be overrun, the mages killed, the sealing failed, and this rift would continue consuming villages until someone with more resources and less optimism came to deal with it properly. Then Seraphine did something Kale had never seen before. She threw back her head and screamed, but this wasn't the battle cry from the Crimson Keep. This was something older, something primal, a sound that resonated not in his ears but in his chest, his bones, his soul. Power erupted from her in a wave of crimson light that washed across the chamber, and where it touched the void touched, they simply stopped. Frozen, unable to move, trapped in her presence as surely as she'd been trapped in those chains. 20 seconds, the mage called. Seraphine held the entities frozen, her entire body trembling with effort, power radiating from her in waves that made reality itself ripple. Blood ran from her nose, her eyes, her ears, the price of channeling power beyond what her weakened body could safely handle. 15 seconds. Her knees buckled, but she didn't fall, holding herself upright through will alone. The entities strained against her power, and Kale could see cracks forming in the invisible barrier she'd created. They wouldn't hold much longer. 10 seconds. "Sarah, you have to release them," Kale shouted, moving to her side. "You're killing yourself." "Not yet," she gasped, and blood frothed at her lips. "Almost there." 5 seconds. The entities broke through. They surged forward in a final desperate rush, and Kale knew with absolute certainty that they wouldn't make it, that Seraphine had given everything and it still wouldn't be enough. Then light erupted from the ceiling array, brilliant, pure, absolute. It shot up from the floor in a column that engulfed the rift, and Kale heard something like reality screaming as the wound closed. The void touch dissolved like shadows before sunrise, their stolen bodies collapsing as the entities lost cohesion, and the overwhelming wrongness of the space suddenly snapped back to something approaching normal. Silence fell, broken only by harsh breathing and the sound of bodies hitting stone as the freed villagers collapsed. Seraphine fell too, and Kale caught her before she hit the ground. She was cold, colder than usual, cold like death itself, and her eyes were unfocused, blood still streaming from her nose and ears. "Stay with me," he said urgently, cradling her against his chest. "Sarah, stay with me. Medics, now." The field medics rushed over, hands glowing with healing magic, but Cale saw the concern in their faces as they assessed her condition. One shook his head slightly, a gesture that said not good but not fatal, we'll see. Seraphine's eyes found Cale's and she smiled weakly. "Did we win?" "Yes," he said, and he didn't care that his voice was shaking. "We won. You magnificent, terrifying, absolutely insane woman, we won." "Good," she whispered. Then her eyes closed and she went limp in his arms. Seraphine woke 3 days later in the guild's medical wing, in a bed that smelled of antiseptic and clean linen, with sunlight streaming through a window and Cale asleep in a chair beside her, his hand wrapped around hers even in sleep. She spent a long moment simply looking at him, at the new scars on his face from the battle, the exhaustion written in every line of his body, the way he'd positioned himself between her bed and the door even while unconscious. This strange, brave, impossibly kind man who'd freed her from chains both physical and metaphorical, who'd chosen to see a person where everyone else saw a monster. She squeezed his hand gently, and his eyes opened immediately, Hunter's reflexes always alert. When he saw her awake, his face transformed, relief and joy warring for dominance. "You're awake," he said unnecessarily but understandably. "I'm awake," she confirmed, her voice rough from disuse. "How long?" 3 days. The healers said you burned through centuries of stored vitality in those 30 seconds. You're lucky to be alive." He paused. "The villagers are going to be fine. All of them. The medics said there might be some psychological trauma from being possessed, but physically they're whole. We saved them, Sarah. All of them." She felt tears prick her eyes. "We did, didn't we? Actually saved people. Made a difference." "You made the difference," Cale corrected. "I was just there to look pretty and stab things." Despite everything, she laughed, then winced as the motion pulled at still healing wounds. "You're terrible at accepting credit." "I learned from the best," he said, squeezing her hand. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, content simply to be alive and together. Then Seraphine asked the question that had been building in her mind since she woke. "What happens now? Do we go back to training? Wait for the next assignment?" "If you want," Cale said. "But Elara said something interesting when you were unconscious. She said the guild has been looking for someone to establish a new program, training hunters in magical theory and exotic entity identification, teaching the next generation how to deal with threats most people don't even know exist." He met her eyes. "She asked if you'd be interested in heading it up. Said your knowledge is too valuable to risk losing, and teaching would let you preserve your people's legacy while keeping you safe from the worst dangers." Seraphine felt something shift in her chest. Teaching. Preserving knowledge. Building something instead of just fighting. It was everything she'd told Cale she wanted, being handed to her like a gift. "And you?" she asked. "What about you?" "I'd stay on as an active hunter," Cale said. "Take assignments, investigate threats, do the field work. But I'd be based here, so I'd come home to you every time. And maybe," he added with a slight smile, "you could teach me some of that magical theory. I was absolutely useless in that fight compared to you." "You saved my life at least twice," Seraphine protested. "And you saved mine 4 times. I counted. I have some catching up to do." She pulled him closer. He came willingly, perching on the edge of her bed, and kissed him properly for the first time in 3 days. He tasted like coffee and worry and relief, and she felt something inside her settle, a piece clicking into place that she hadn't known was missing. "I love you," she said when they broke apart, and was surprised by how easily the words came. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. I love you, Cale Dravener, and I want to build a life with you. Here, at the guild, teaching and hunting and figuring out what comes next. Together." His smile was brilliant enough to rival the sun. "I love you too, Sarah. Have since you first smiled at me in that inn in Thornhaven, I think. Maybe even before that. And yes, let's build something. Something good. Something that matters." "Together," she said. "Together," he agreed. The classroom was full for Seraphine's advanced magical theory lecture. 30 students, a mix of young hunters and established veterans looking to expand their knowledge, all focused on the vampire standing at the front of the room with a piece of chalk in one hand and a smile on her face. Which brings us to the fundamental principle of reality anchoring, she was saying, sketching a diagram on the board that looked like geometric insanity to anyone who wasn't versed in multidimensional theory. The void exists in the spaces between definite states. To seal a rift, you must assert definition, make reality more real, if you will, until the undefined cannot exist in that space. The equations look complex, but the underlying concept is quite simple. Watching from the doorway, Cale felt pride swell in his chest. This was what she was meant to be, not a weapon, not a monster, but a teacher. Someone who took knowledge that would have died with her and passed it on, ensuring it survived into another generation. She was brilliant up there, patient with confused students, passionate about her subject, utterly in her element. She caught sight of him and smiled, and that smile was just for him, warm, loving, full of promise. He smiled back, content to wait until her lecture ended, in no rush. They had time now. Time to build the life they both wanted, time to explore this love that had grown between prisoner and rescuer and blossomed into something neither of them had expected but both treasured. That evening they sat on the balcony of their apartment, larger now to accommodate Seraphine's growing personal library, watching the sun set over the Guild Valley, her wings wrapped around both of them like a dark blanket. "I'm happy," she said, sounding surprised. "Genuinely, completely happy. I don't think I've felt that in, maybe ever." "You deserve it," Cale said, pulling her closer. "You chose to be better than your nature demanded. You earned this happiness." "We earned it," she corrected. "I would never have made it this far without you. You saw me when I couldn't see myself. Believed in me when I had no faith left. Loved me when I thought I was unlovable." "You were always lovable," Cale said softly. "You just needed someone to show you." They sat in silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, two people who should never have met, should never have fallen in love, should never have built a life together. But here they were anyway, human and vampire, mortal and ancient, warrior and teacher, finding peace and purpose in each other's arms. "Thank you," Seraphine whispered into the gathering night, "for unchaining me. For teaching me that desire doesn't have to be hunger, that power doesn't have to mean domination, that love is possible even for monsters who choose to be something more." "You were never a monster," Cale said. "You were always just Sarah. And that was always enough." She kissed him as the first stars emerged, and somewhere in the guild below, life continued, hunters training, scholars studying, families living, all protected by the same organization that now sheltered a vampire princess and her human love. The world had changed. They had changed. And in that change they had found something precious and rare, a future worth fighting for, a present worth savoring, and a love that transcended the boundaries of mortality, nature, and legend itself. Together they had unchained each other. Together they would face whatever came next. Together they were home.